Okay, so by the time this video goes up, we will be at the end of Pride Month, but around here we try to read queer all year, so I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to kind of highlight some titles, particularly from the backlist, that are worth your time the rest of the year as well as during June. Now, as always, I'm going to miss books, so feel free to pop your favorite backlist titles in the comments as well so that we can add them to the list. And also, going back through my Goodreads for this was very interesting because it became really evident how much more accessible queer books are now than they were even like 5 years ago, which seems like a very obvious thing to say, but is also important in terms of thinking about how far we've come, but also how much further we have to go, and also how representation has morphed and grown in a positive way during that time as well. As always, still a lot of work to be done, but I do still think we have a lot to celebrate, and I also think that it's important to kind of emphasize support of backlist titles, especially now more than ever. One, because we are seeing a backlist of queer titles in a really big way for the first time in a long time. And also, as we've talked about, as we have seen book bans grow exponentially over the past year or two, we are seeing these titles come under fire. And honestly, I think that the rise in queer representation, unfortunately, is part of this concentrated effort to ban books. And so we need to show them as much support as possible. And we have so many wonderful frontlist titles that we will continue to support and champion, but we're going to highlight some of the backlist here so that you maybe get a recommendation that you may have missed in the past few years. I maybe will get some recommendations that I missed in the past few years. Also, a lot of these books are bigger titles, so I'm not going to pretend like I'm introducing you to anything necessarily, but I also did try to stay away from titles like Red, White, and Royal Blue, things that we already know about. I have the assumption that you know about that one. So we're going to talk about some of the other books that I definitely think you should read. Starting with, I am currently reading, and now this is a frontlist title, but stay with me here for a second. I am currently reading the new Brandon Taylor, The Late Americans. We talked about Filthy Animals, his short story collection, last year. What I want to talk about today is Real Life, his debut novel, which is this perfect summer book as well. I believe it takes place over Labor Day weekend, if I'm remembering correctly. I listened to it on audio, and it has this beautiful tension to it. When I first read it, I talked about, and I don't know if I talked about it here, to be completely honest. I don't think that I was fully up and running on booktube at the time. It was just kind of like I was starting to dabble. I maybe talked about it in an audiobook video. It's irrelevant. But the book is about a young queer Black man in STEM at a Midwestern research university. And the way that Taylor writes like the Midwest is so compelling to me. I think we are set, well, I know we are set in the Midwest again because we're in Iowa in the newest book, but there is that real kind of like subtlety of like Midwestern passive aggressiveness, but then also our character is dealing with a lot of passive aggressive racism, microaggressions, all of these things that is really rage inducing and continue to fester. But one of the things I found most interesting about this novel is the way that it's almost kind of realism in a novel format. I would be so interested, as I think I've said before, to see Taylor translated to the stage. And I feel like I saw this kind of on Twitter recently too, but I don't remember where or in what context. But I was thinking about it when I read that book as it kind of revitalizing the idea of realism for me. I, have a theater degree. I have seen a lot of realism. I've engaged with a lot of realism on the stage, and it has never been my favorite. I think especially in kind of the modern theater moment, I got really tired of seeing like families at a dining room table kind of hashing it out. But this isn't about a family, it's about a found family in some ways, and it is a little bit hashing things out, but we're kind of denied that real catharsis that we want as readers, forcing us to really interrogate what is being explored in the novel, what our characters are dealing with, and it's over like this extended long weekend. And so it feels like it has this almost kind of like real-time pace to it. It's languid in a way that is both kind of gets you caught up in that haze, but it also lets that tension build in this really delicious and ultimately frustrating way because it is in many ways emulating real life. And so I think it is just such a stunning debut, and it was such a strong debut that it's made me pick up Filthy Animals and now The Late Americans with no questions. So I will surely be reporting back on this one, but if you have not read Real Life yet, I would definitely encourage you to do that. And then to switch from adult to young adult, we'll keep ping-ponging around this whole video, to be completely honest. I believe I mentioned this book in my recommendations based on Olivia Rodrigo's Sour album video, and that is Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki. This is a young adult graphic novel about a young girl who is pining after this person, Laura Dean, who she had kind of been with. It was kind of casual. Laura Dean is kind of a womanizer, and our protagonist, Freddie, is kind of pining after her. Honestly, thinking about this, I also could have recommended this in my books to read if you like August by Taylor Swift video, but I think that this is just a really fun and also like ingenious, insightful young adult graphic novel because it's so emotionally raw, and it gets at a lot of those like uncomfy teenage emotions, like that pining, but also like what that pining does for those around us. One, how we're kind of trying to hide some of those emotions, the heartbreak of it all, but also like how that heartbreak impacts our friendships and how we show up for the people around us, and how it maybe makes us blind to the needs of those close to us and those around us, how heartbreak can make us selfish in some ways. And I think that the way it navigated friendships in this was what made it so appealing to me, because it was so relatable from that like teenage yearning standpoint, but also from what that friendship dynamic is in the wake of all that, when you have your friends kind of looking at you and saying, okay, it's time to move on. But then what does moving on look like? So if for some reason you haven't picked this one up yet, I would highly, highly encourage you to do so. I absolutely loved it. And then for a book that is technically Backlist, but just came out last year and I have talked about multiple times and will continue to talk about multiple more, I am sure, Vagabonds by Elagosha Asundi. This is perfect if you haven't heard me talk about this yet, if you like interconnected short stories. Because while this is technically a novel, it really is interconnected short stories, but it's looking at the kind of queer community, the underground community of Lagos, and it's looking at this through the lens of them being vagabonds and them being kind of outside of mainstream society. And this is set up by multiple quotes in the beginning, which include, again, one of my favorite setup quotes in recent memory by Toni Morrison: all paradises, all utopias are designed by who is not there, by the people who are not allowed in. And then we, of course, have the definitions of vagabonds that further kind of set up that dynamic, and I think really are a wonderful entry into the novel. And if you have not by chance heard me talk about this book before, I want to talk briefly about the entry into this world, because it really is exploring Lagos as a kind of city inhabited by spirits, this really vibrant, lively thing, and we do have this idea of kind of protectors and being at the whim of gods in some way, but it also is really examining Christianity in relation to the culture, especially in how that has impacted the queer culture. And I think one of the really interesting ways that this is done is in the first story that's kind of leading us into the underworld. It follows a protagonist named Thomas. And so we are clearly paralleling the Doubting Thomas story, and then we are kind of inverted into the underworld of Lagos, and then we get to explore this world and the people amidst it. And these lives and characters intertwine, and it is just a vibrant exploration of all of these people, giving us little snapshots of different parts of this world. So I absolutely love this book. It is out in paperback now, so if you have not read it, you should 100% pick it up. I adore it, and I have talked about it in more depth on a Feature Friday if you need further encouragement for any reason. And then a book I mentioned just briefly in last week's Feature Friday, because it was one of the first mainstream historical lesbian romances I personally read, which is saying a lot because I distinctly remember reading this, and I was walking with a friend to see our second performance of Six in Chicago when it did its Broadway tryout, its kind of run at Chicago Shakespeare. So it was the second time we were seeing it. So that kind of dates when I had read this, because it was just after I read that book and I was recommending it to a friend, and that is The Lady's Guide to Celestial Mechanics by Olivia Waite. This follows two heroines, Lucy, who has just watched her childhood sweetheart get married to someone else and is subsequently fleeing after being offered this opportunity to translate this large scientific text. And the person who has offered her this opportunity is Lady Catherine. And so they are in a house together while Lucy is translating this, and they fall in love. Spoiler alert. However, it is also a really lovely exploration of both women in STEM at a particular historical moment and breaking into these predominantly male spaces historically, but then especially in relation to Lady Catherine, appreciating the talents and pursuits that are more often aligned with like women and women's work, particularly for Lady Catherine, needlework, but the talent that goes into that, the care, and all of the different intricacies. And so looking at these two women that are in vastly different realms, but how they can each be appreciated for those talents in those realms and what it means to be pursuing both of those things. And so it is a really honest look at that. I need to reread it. I haven't read it in a while. I also think it's one of the better covers. I say in relation both to Olivia Waite's own Avon covers, and also this was around the same time that Cat Sebastian was being published or started to get published by Avon. And I love, love, love her early romances. They brought me to her as an author, but also the blending of the two subjects on the covers of her books never felt natural to me. The embraces often felt like really forced, and it just made me sad because the books were so good. So this cover, when I first saw it, it really blew me out of the water. It was a traditional historical romance cover for these two women, and I absolutely loved it. So if historical romance is your jam, if you've been in a kind of Bridgerton type mood, this is definitely something to pick up if you haven't yet by any chance. And then speaking of picking up, if you haven't yet had a chance, Cemetery Boys by Aiden Thomas, which was an incredibly impactful debut. It is fantastic. Here we of course are following our protagonist Yadriel as he is working to become a brujo with his family, to be taken seriously as a brujo by his family, and this is complicated by the appearance of a classmate turned ghost, Julian, and then further complicated by falling for said ghost. So if you, like me, loved Meg Cabot's Mediator series as a teen, sure, that dates me, but such is life. You will absolutely adore this. And if you just like ghosts and romance and YA adventures, you will absolutely adore this regardless. So I encourage you to read this if you have not yet picked it up. It was and has been a very buzzy book for a long time since it came out, but for a reason. So always recommend this for sure. And then speaking of buzzy since it came out, let's move on to something that feels pretty obvious, feels like a classic at this point, but I think it really does always need to be mentioned, Angels in America by Tony Kushner. This is, of course, an epic two-part play. We've got Angels in America, Millennium Approaches, and Angels in America, Perestroika. You generally see Millennium Approaches produced more. If you're only seeing one produced, you will see theaters producing both, often in rep. Sometimes it just depends. I admittedly have not seen a production of Angels in America on stage since I was in college and worked on a production of Millennium Approaches, and then we did a stage reading of Perestroika in the next semester. However, there is the HBO version, of course. I just always am very interested in how the end of Millennium Approaches is staged. And so this, like I said, is basically, I would consider a classic at this point in American literature. I think this is going to prove the test of time. I think it already has to a large extent, and I think it's going to end up there with things like The Crucible, Death of a Salesman. It is important, and I continue to catch echoes of it, whether it be intentional references to The Great Work Begins on someone's TikTok, or maybe intentional references to The Great Work Begins in an inauguration speech. I have not confirmed that, but I definitely felt it. And I'm not gonna lie to you, as a sophomore, I believe, yes, I was a sophomore when we produced this, I learned a lot about American history from this play, from working on this show as a dramaturg. It takes place during the AIDS epidemic, and even in like 2010, going back, talking to friends in high school at the time, or like former classmates, there were still a lot of misconceptions about AIDS. And so I can only imagine how that has progressed in the sense that it is even more historically distant. So I feel like the immediacy of all that was lost in a lot of ways in the 80s is maybe not there in the same way, but I don't know. It also taught me important things about historical figures like Roy Cohn, figures that at the time were incredibly important and are parallel to a lot of figures we see today, but I had no reference to. So I think it is a masterwork in so many ways. If you are a theater kid, you know I'm sorry. If you have read The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai, which is fabulous, but if you have read that and not read Angels in America, I would encourage you to also pick this up. And yes, I am kind of sad to this day that it is the tie-in cover, but I was a student and that's what I got. So now to stay in the realm of plays for a second. Now granted, this is a somewhat dated play in the sense that it came out in 2000 and thinking about all of the way dialogues have progressed since then, but this was also the first time that I saw a lesbian relationship really centralized, and that is Stop Kiss by Deanna Sun. Now I will say this does center around a hate crime, and so if that is not the headspace or the place you want to visit, that's completely understandable. However, I spent a lot of time with this play in college, particularly because it was used for a lot of scene work in my Acting 2 class. Now granted, I haven't spent a whole lot of time with it since then, but it always has had a special place in my heart. And even though it takes place around this really tragic event, or that's the kind of central action of the story, it is written in this kind of like dual timeline, like moving in and out of the past and the present. And so I don't want to ruin the ending for you, but it doesn't end with a moment of hate and violence, and it kind of is a reminder to live in the suspended joy as much as possible. And so it's obviously a more complicated thing, a more complicated conversation. I do want to live in the queer joy as much as possible, but I think that this is a really interesting exploration of examining that joy amidst the pain that is unfortunately historically unavoidable. And unfortunately also presently unavoidable. But then if we want to switch gears and look at a potential utopia, but also the idea of community and what it means to live in community and protect community, we can look at Pet by Oweke Emezi. I unfortunately do not have a copy of Pet. I really should rectify that. I do have the prequel Bitter, which I was not expecting to enjoy as much as Pet because it's more of a dystopia to Pet's utopia. Obviously, it's a complicated utopia, but traditionally I don't like dystopias as much. I don't think I can blanket say I don't like them. I just don't gravitate toward them. But Bitter also really explored community in a really engaging way. But Pet looks at community and the idea of monsters and what it means when all the monsters have been defeated and whether they have been. But it also has a trans protagonist where her transness is never in question. It is just an accepted part of the world. It's commented on in like relation to how it sometimes impacts how she functions in the world, but it never others her. And I think it's such a beautiful accepted fact amidst this larger exploration and is part of the utopia established in this book, even if it is a utopia under attack in some ways. And additionally, if you've heard me talk about this book before, you've probably heard me say this book impacted me so strongly at the time I read it. I thought it was so smart, so succinct, so well done that I was like tempted to go back and get a teaching license. I mean, not really, but if I were to teach any book, I think it would be this one because I can just imagine it in a Socratic seminar. I can just imagine the conversations that could come up around this book because it is so skillfully done and there are so many layers, and it doesn't talk down to its readers, whether you consider this a middle grade or a young adult. I personally felt like Pet trended more toward middle grade to me in my reading and Bitter more to young adult, but I think a lot of that is open to interpretation as well, so all part of the discussion. But if you have not read this one, it is a wonderful, wonderful book, and I absolutely think you should, as well as reading like all of Emezi's stuff. Now granted, I have not read all of Emezi's stuff yet. I am behind, but everything that I have read is just so wonderful, so impactful, and there is also so much diversity in type of storytelling that is just indicative of so much talent. So I'm so excited to see what stories we continue to get, but for now, Pet is toward the top of the top for me. And then in another example of I have a book by an author, but I'm going to recommend you a different one. You should read Sorrowland by River Solomon, absolutely. I have talked about this book before in a Feature Friday as well, but you should really read An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. I put this book off for way too long. I used to see it recommended, I believe, especially on Book Riot. This is the days where I was getting a lot of book recommendations from Book Riot, which served me well. I just kind of fell off with the website a little bit. But this is like a dystopian space opera kind of thing, and it has so much going on. It's like this space station that kind of mirrors the antebellum South, and our protagonist is really othered by basically everyone on the ship. But then there is a death that happens that maybe links to her mother's suicide decades before, and there's like a potential like civil war or a coup. There is just a lot going on here, and I think it is so indicative of Solomon's talent. They really are great with language and building out this tension and this anger, but it's a different kind of tension and anger than when I was talking about with like Brandon Taylor's Real Life. It's still building and simmering under the surface, but it almost feels louder in some ways. It's a little bit more active. There is a kind of stoicism that I associate with the anger in Real Life, and here, even when it's being kind of suppressed, there is that action somehow related to it. I don't know how to explain it more articulately. I don't know that I'm even really getting it right, but I think that that's something that's going on in my mind. But if you're looking for excellent sci-fi, this is the one. And then because I'm going to keep bouncing around with absolutely no rhyme or reason, we have How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. This is a memoir, and it is so emotionally raw and honest. I'm sure I've talked about this before. I saw Jones speak about this at the American Writers Museum during this book tour, and I found even the concept of the book tour for this so interesting because there is so much emotional vulnerability here, and because this is a memoir, he's laying his own life open, his own grief open in many ways. I couldn't fully really comprehend the bravery of standing up and presenting this every night to an audience, whether they'd read the book or not, because it is so vulnerable. And I think it is just such a fantastic read. This book is what has led me to Jones's poetry because it is so evident that he is a poet in the writing of this. The language is so specific, it's so succinct, it is serving a purpose, and it gets in a really incisive kind of way. And like I've said before, even when I don't feel necessarily smart enough to fully appreciate it, I can definitely recognize it. But if you're in the mood for a really great memoir, this is the one. And then let's move back to young adult for a second with Her Royal Highness by Rachel Hawkins. This came out in 2019 and unfortunately is part of an uncompleted series, and is the series that kind of transitioned Hawkins from young adult to adult because her publisher decided not to continue this series. Now, I'm looking at Goodreads now, and Her Royal Highness has over 35,000 ratings, which I consider pretty good, but apparently, granted I don't know what it was around the time, was not enough at the time for the publisher to pick up the third book. Now, the good news is these books are standalone romances within this kind of overarching structure of the royal romances, and Her Royal Highness follows Millie, who has been accepted to this prestigious overseas boarding school after finding out that her like maybe best friend, maybe girlfriend has been cheating on her, and so she's already kind of like in an emotionally tempestuous spot, and then she gets roomed with Flora, who is a princess. But literally, she's the Princess of Scotland. And so you've got a little bit of that hate to love dynamic going on, further complicated by like the teen girl dynamic. So it was just really delightful. And I was sad that the series didn't continue, but I am so, so happy that we did get this one. And I think it continues to be one that you should pick up. And with that, this may be a good opportunity to do a whole slew of young adult titles. Let's start with Let's Talk About Love by Claire Kahn. This was the first asexual rep that I think I've read, or at least it's the first that I really remember being asexual rep forward. And it follows Alice, whose girlfriend has just broken up with her because of her asexuality, but she's really focused on her summer job at the library. But this summer job at the library brings a new romantic interest into her life. And it's just a delightful young adult rom-com. And it also has a really special place in my heart because I read it the first time I was laid off, and it really kind of put a smile on my face. I just remember it being a nice escape with some great exploration as well. And if we're looking for another great summer YA rom-com, we've got The Summer of Jody Perez and the Best Burger in Los Angeles by Amy Spalding. This follows a young woman who has gotten this dream internship at this boutique that she is really interested in. And she's a fashion blogger, and there is another intern at the store during the summer that she kind of gets a crush on, some feelings develop, they start hanging out. But then in addition to these feelings, they find out that they're both going to be vying for the same permanent position following the internship. So it's just got a lot of like fun summer romance, but also kind of that stage of adolescence where you're like, eyeing the next thing and kind of setting yourself up and following your passions and dreaming big. And it's all kind of framed around this summer of exploration and adventure, and was just a really good time. And then we've got Felix Ever After by Case and Calendar, which I would assume is probably one of the biggest trans rep YA titles. And I think it's also just one of the best contemporary YAs I had read in a long time at the time it came out, and I assume it holds up because the ratings remain consistently high. The stakes of the book are obviously high, but it was just so honest in the kind of dynamics of young adults and like cliques and friend groups at the time, and also just like the way interpersonal relationships go. It was also honest and vulnerable emotionally with its characters. It wasn't afraid to let its characters make mistakes and grow from those mistakes in an honest way that I think is incredibly important to be reflected to teenagers. You're not always going to be perfect. You're not always going to make the right choice, but then what do you do after that? And also just being able to figure yourself out at any stage of life. And I think it's just an incredibly well-written book, period. Not that all of these aren't, but I just really, really love this title and think it is incredibly important. And then continuing our young adult books, we've got You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson, who is a Hoosier author. And this follows Liz, a band kid who loses a scholarship opportunity that she had been counting on, and then she remembers that running for prom queen has money attached to it, and so she runs. She does not anticipate catching feelings for one of the other prom queen contestants. So this is just a really fun rom-com. I loved the Hoosier connection. I actually texted my brother after finishing this book because he teaches band, and I remember him talking about how the standards were kind of pushing literacy across all classes, and him working to figure out how to kind of combine literacy instruction in a band class. And so I was like, do you need books for your classroom? Because I would totally buy you this book for your classroom. And he was like, not like that. I would ask him more about that curriculum, but I haven't. Additionally, because I do believe I've talked about this before, or I've talked about it somewhere, maybe just, you know, when I reviewed the book, I was surprisingly crowned prom queen at my own prom, which still baffles my mind over a decade later because that was not anticipated. I mean, I remember texting my mom on my Indie flip phone, just like in shock. Like I was kind of chatting with friends at my table when they were announcing prom court, and my friend Jill just, you know, looked at me and said, Melody, they called your name, you need to go up there. And I just did not process at the time. But anyway, I remember saying that I was more invested in whether Liz was gonna get prom queen than those like few moments before it had really sunk in that I was prom queen, because I remember it was down to me and one other girl, Caitlin, and they were calling first runner up, and I already was like baffled that that was potentially me. So I remember getting ready to take a step forward and they called Caitlin's name and I was like, what is going on? I was more invested in Liz getting prom queen because there was something, I was devastated for her at the beginning of this book when she lost her scholarship, because I also had received a pretty prestigious scholarship in high school that I worked so hard for, and I know how much goes into that and what it represented for her in this book. I got really emotional about this girl's scholarship in this book, and maybe that is just showing me my age because I was way more invested in the scholarship than in the romance. I mean, I was invested in the romance, don't get me wrong, but I wanted this girl to go out and chase her dreams. And so I don't know, maybe that is just saying something about my priorities, but I absolutely loved this book. But kind of segueing into focuses on things that weren't potentially the main focus for the audience, Sirius the Great is Not Okay by Adib Khorram, which I have talked about before and will probably talk about again because it's a great book. Now, I still haven't read the sequel, so that is my shame, but the first book is fantastic. And there is this kind of like summer romance element to everything, especially as our main character is coming to terms with his own sexuality, especially in relation to his family and his kind of history. And a lot of the book, because it involves him and his family going to Iran for the summer, involves him kind of coming to terms with himself in so many different ways. And I found myself, while traditionally I really should have been focused on the summer romance of it all, that is what would have been the main like draw for me once upon a time. And it was still a draw, absolutely. But one, Darius always deserves better. as is evidenced in the sequel that I still have not yet read, but I found myself really intent on the father-son relationship in this book and the exploration of that relationship that I think was done so well. And I think that it's also a really great example, especially in young adult spaces where romance is already kind of prevalent. And I admit as a reader that I gravitate toward romance anyway, but that the exploration of your sexuality or your queer identity, whatever that may be, romance isn't the be-all end-all of that exploration, which moves us into A Dark and Starless Forest by Sarah Hallowell. Usual disclaimer, Sarah is a friend, so I'm not completely unbiased in this book. In fact, I actually am in the acknowledgements of this book, which I don't know if I've mentioned before because I reviewed it before I had picked up my physical copy and I hadn't seen it yet, and it made me cry a little bit. I don't know if it'll show, but that's me. I'm Melody. Anyway, so this book is really special for a lot of reasons. One, it's got kind of like young adult horror. It involves magic. It involves teen girl rage and the kind of claiming of that anger and that rage and what that power means, claiming your power in so many different ways. But it also involves a lot of queer identities within the book, including a bisexual main character. But romance is not at the center of this book, and the idea of still being valid in your identity regardless of how you are partnered or what relationship you are in. So yeah, this is just a really special book, and I am so excited for her sophomore novel that comes out later this year. Keep your eyes peeled for that. I'm pretty sure I posted about it on my community tab as well, so get it on your radars. And then what I believe is my last young adult title that I wanted to talk about today, but I'm kind of all over the place as usual, aren't I? When the Moon Was Ours by Anna Marie McLemore. This, to this day, is so far still my favorite McLemore. Now, to be fair, I have not read all of their work at this point yet, but I love this book. The Weight of Feathers already got a lot of buzz when it first came out, and I want to say that this was their first book where queer characters, specifically trans characters, were at the center, but I could be wrong there. But it is absolutely my favorite. It is lyrical, it is magical realism at its best, and it is an incredible character study of these two young people trying to find their place in the world and clinging to each other and what they represent to each other while finding that place in the world. It's beautiful, it's magical. It's just like the best representation, I think, of McLemore's work, which has branched out in different directions. They continue to take risks, do new and interesting things. Absolutely. I've still loved their work, don't get me wrong, but I find myself going back to this one because it just looms so large in my mind. And then to go on to a middle grade title that took me and my friend Mandy, who was the children's lead at the bookstore at the time, by storm. StarCrossed by Barbara D follows two young theater kids and explores what it means to get a crush, specifically a play crush, which is a whole nother beast. Listen, if you've been in a high school play, and I assume that there are other equivalents, but when you're spending that much concentrated time with people, the magic of the dark backstage, you know, romances, crushes, what have you, develop in the wings. And this time it's exploring what happens when that crush is on a girl. So this follows an 8th grade production of Romeo and Juliet, which isn't too far off. When I was in 7th grade, our 7th and 8th grade did a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, although we updated it in a way that we probably shouldn't have been allowed to touch that text. Regardless, I played Helena in 7th grade. It was great fun. But this book explores what it means to have a crush, and can you have a crush on both a boy and a girl? But I remember it speaking to those like adolescent preteen emotions in a really kind of honest way, and I think that it's important to recognize those emotions and how they differ from like later teen emotions too. So I just thought it was a really lovely book, and it warmed my theater kid heart. And then let's swing around for a couple more adult titles. First of all, we have Once Ghosted, Twice Shy by Alyssa Cole. This is a novella in her Reluctant Royals series that I admittedly liked better than the full-length lesbian romance we got in her Runaway Royals series. And this follows the aide to the prince and a princess in theory in her own kind of whirlwind romance in New York City, and I just thought it was an utter delight. And I personally love both of the novellas in this series so much that I wished they were full-length novels in the series. I kind of get why they weren't, because the focus, the leads in the novellas weren't technically royal in the name of the series, but I loved the characters in both the novellas so much that I wish we had gotten more time with them. And so this is of course one of those novellas, definitely something you should check out, especially as we are still waiting for a new Alyssa Cole. And then we have Matrix by Lauren Groff, which came out a couple years ago. This is probably, I would say, one of my Feature Friday reviews that has done the worst in terms of views, but is still one I am really proud of. We talk some French feminism for a second. We talk about the idea of courtly love, which is very important in this because we have a lead in this book that is being put away or going to this convent, even though she is in love with Eleanor of Aquitaine. But it is this idea of courtly love in some ways and the idea of her being unattainable. But it definitely looks at Marie and this convent and her visions through a sapphic lens, and it's exploring the ways women can hold power at this time, especially interesting when kind of contrasted with Eleanor of Aquitaine. And it's also looking and exploring communities of women, and also includes Groff's really stellar writing. And I believe this is the first time that she's writing in a historical context, but with sentences like, "Hatred is worse, and Marie's hatred would rip her limb from limb if she lets her attention stray from it." And then finally, in this whirlwind, we were not going to leave without talking about The Chosen and the Beautiful by Niveau, which I have mentioned on this channel so many times by now for a good reason. This is a queer re-examination of The Great Gatsby through the lens of Jordan Baker, and it is utterly fabulous. It is short, it is succinct, it is magical, it is deep, and it really kind of follows the beats from The Great Gatsby and expands them at the same time, because I did reread Gatsby before reading this because it had been so long since I had explored Gatsby and wasn't sure if I would remember the beats well enough to really know how it was interacting with the source material. And I also thought it was important because with the rights coming up, I knew we would be getting a lot of reimaginings, reinterpretations of Gatsby, as we are across mediums at this point. But I consider this the best of the best because I thought it had something really interesting and unique to say, and I loved the magic of all of it, the magic and the danger and the real exploration of the kind of underlying emptiness of these characters and how Vaux played with that within the context of this novel. Now, additionally, Anna Marie McLemore does have an installment of the Classics Reimagined young adult series that does take a look at The Great Gatsby through a queer lens as well, so is also something that is on my radar and I need to get to, but I absolutely loved The Chosen and the Beautiful regardless. So that was kind of a haphazard, all over the place cursory overview of a lot of titles that I've really enjoyed. Again, these are more backlist titles than things that have come out within the last like 6 months to a year. Some of them, like Vagabonds, skirted pretty close. But as I said before as well, I would love you to share titles in the backlist that you would encourage others to pick up as well. If you have thoughts on any of these titles, feel free to share them. Thanks as always for hanging out and listening to what I have to say. Like, subscribe, comment, whatever you're feeling. We are so close to 1,000, so all interaction is very much appreciated. But like I said, you just being here is appreciated. Read something good. You've got lots of great options to choose from here, and yeah, bye.